Welcome to the program. I am Folashade Ogurinde. It's been a week since Russia invaded Ukraine, a situation which has not only affected global oil prices, but led to an unprecedented loss of human lives. Crude oil prices have spiraled above $100 per barrel, and the first time since 2014 after Russia attacked Ukraine and continued a major offensive. While the rise in oil price should ordinarily mean good news for Nigeria, stakeholders and industry experts have said otherwise. The invasion has also led to displacement of millions of Ukrainian residents, including Nigerians, some of which have been evacuated back to the country. Joining me to discuss this further is economist Kalu Aja. Thank you very much for your time. Now, we've seen a steady increase in oil price, which is currently above $100 per barrel. What does this mean for Nigeria?
Thanks. Good morning for having me here. I think the main thing for Nigeria is that we import PMS, which is a byproduct of crude oil. So as the crude oil prices go up, then our cost of subsidy to pay for that PMS import also goes up. So we're going to see like NNPC is already doing a zero remittance to FARC. That's going to continue because there's no reduction now in the price of crude. So that's going to be a big problem for the budget deficit, right? Because we have no inflow from FARC. From NNPC, going into FARC. So big problem there.
Now, do you agree with the Minister of State for Petroleum Resources, Timi Persiva, who said that the increase in prices of global crude oil is not good for the country?
It is correct. It's not good for the country. We have no local refining capacity. So essentially, the PMS in our cars in Lagos, Kano, and wherever is imported. And you're going to pay with Forex to get those imports in. So once crude oil prices go up, it does affect us. And we see it even before the fuel price that we have right now. So we're going to pay a lot more for imported PMS because the local refining capacity doesn't exist anymore. So that's going to be bad news. That's really going to be where it's going to hurt our budget. So I think it's perfectly correct. We are currently importing PMS. So when we do the swap for crude oil, we still have to pay an element of that import with our Forex, which is basically going down. So once crude oil prices go up, the CBN has got to pay with its foreign reserves to import PMS into Nigeria. So NNPC is covering that subsidy. So once prices internationally go up, NNPC has got to pay. That means zero remittance to FARC. You have zero remittance to FARC, that means we have more pressure to pay local salaries. So an increase in oil price really means and translates to Nigeria's deficit, the budget deficit widening, and salaries getting caught up and possibly not paid. We might be back where we were in December when the federal government was announcing that there's going to be delays in salaries. That's if this current crunch continues, if the current supply crunch with crude oil continues. That won't be good news for Nigeria at all.
Now, with Nigeria being one of the top 10 countries with the largest gas reserve in the world, has Nigeria missed an opportunity on the backdrop on impending sanction by the U.S. on Russian gas?
Yes, both gas and crude oil. We've missed an opportunity there to grow the reserves from reserves to actual products that can be sold on the international market. I think we've had this gas pipeline to go from the south through Ajaokuta, through Kano, then through all the way to Europe. Imagine if we had that now, that would be a viable alternative to supply Europe gas, and the prices are like through the roof. But we don't have that pipeline even in Nigeria, nor do we have means to really replace the supply that Russia is going to lose. I think Qatar is the largest country that supplies gas after Russia, and they've said no country can pick up the slack that Russia is going to drop off. So it's a big missed opportunity for Nigeria that we cannot meet that demand. And even if those orders came in, taking it by ship makes it more expensive, far more expensive than what the Russians could supply Europe with. So yes, both not just gas, also crude oil. Our assumptions for the year is about 1.8 or so. According to OPEC, we're doing about 1.4. So we're missing about 400,000 barrels there. If you multiply that by the current oil prices, you just see how much that Nigeria is losing, both on oil and gas in terms of revenues, because we cannot meet this growing demand at the moment.
Now, top world economies have begun, placing one or two sanctions on Russia for invading Ukraine. But how do you see this playing out on the global economy?
It depends really on how long the war is and what happens during the war. Right now, Boeing, Airbus have pulled up operations from Russia. Google, Microsoft, Apple Pay, really all the Western nations are leaving Russia. Really, Ford is leaving, everyone is leaving. So they can't fly their planes across airspace, nor can they take their ships to ports, right? So where can they fly to, even if they had crude oil? So as long as this continues, then then the impact on the Russian economy gets worse and worse. Russia has about 630 billion in foreign reserves, right? And that could come about 1 year of imports. But the central bank of Russia has now been sanctioned, which means Russia cannot even get access to its gold to pay for its own imports. So it wants to turn to China to use China's quote-unquote SWIFT and also to supply Chinese with gas and then get finished goods in return. So if the war keeps on dragging on, then the Russian economy is going to keep on suffering. But if it's going to be a quick win and they negotiate a peace, then you might see some limited commerce flowing back to Russia, not like pre-war, but enough to just keep them above ground. I think they're prepared for this, but it's sad that it's happening.
And let's take it back home now to Nigeria. Some Nigerians were recently evacuated from Ukraine. Are there economic implications to this?
Yes, massive. I mean, if you look at the trade with Russia and Nigeria, it's not a lot in terms of the dollar terms. I think it's below $500 million annually. I'm putting 2020 figures from the UN. The problem is what that trade is. Nigeria is importing a lot of wheat from Ukraine and Russia. I believe that Nigeria spends about 2 billion every year importing wheat from Ukraine and Russia. I think the president says Nigeria is producing less than 1% of the wheat that we consume. So we can't do import substitution on that wheat. If we try to buy wheat elsewhere, which we would have to do, the price is going to go up because every other nation from Egypt is going to try to buy the same wheat. So the price is going to go up. If the price of wheat goes up, that's inflation right there. So the war in Ukraine and Russia is going to affect the price of local bread and local food. Because once the food inflation goes up, then inflation is also going to trend up. So we're going to feel the impact directly in Nigeria in terms of the imports of wheat. We've already talked about the impact on crude oil prices. That's going to be PMS. There's also Ajaokuta. Ajaokuta, we had an agreement signed with Russia. They were going to put in about $1 billion. They were going to put in about 460 million to revive Ajaokuta, do a technical analysis, perhaps change the furnace. That will be pending now. So on these three issues, food, fuels, and Ajaokuta, and also fertilizer, potash, Ukraine and Russia, same thing. They're a big supplier of this, low-cost supplier. Also Belarus. So it's going to affect our economy directly. We're going to feel the effect in the coming months.
Now, with regards to what I asked earlier, now we've had certain Nigerians who were stuck in Ukraine coming back to Nigeria, and some of these people practically lost their source of livelihood. What do you think the situation would be like for these people in terms of the economy and their personal finance?
Wow. I mean, your heart just goes out to them to see people living in war, because you really can't do anything. You can't go to the bank. You can't close out transactions. School is suspended. So I really feel for them. I really hope that the government is able to identify them, and make them good. If it's possible to send them back somewhere, I don't know, but I don't know see how they can basically pick up their lives back in Nigeria. Most of them left. I have a friend that was there. They literally had to leave the apartment they were in and just start to go towards the Polish border. There's a big problem. All these guys back home with no education or no school to go to, big problem. I feel for them. I hope, right, that the government is able to do a letter or petition to Russia and say, listen, this is what we have lost, and could the Russian government or the international government do a payment back to the Nigerians so they can go back and do school somewhere else? It's going to be a problem if that's not done.
Well, economist Kalu Aja, many thanks for your contribution on this first part conversation on the program.
You're very welcome. You have a great day.
You too. Oh, we'll take a break here, but Money Matters returns shortly. To stay with us. Welcome back. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, has projected that Nigeria's gross debt interest payments will grow by 92% in 2022 from 85.5% in 2021. As at the end of September 2021, debt servicing to ratio stood at 76%, implying that 76 kobo out of every 1 naira earned by the government was spent on payment of interest on debts. IMF's latest statement estimates that debt servicing to consolidated revenue for 2021 and 2022 at 29% and 32.8% respectively. Well, joining me to discuss this further is the Chief Executive Officer of Kari Assets Management Limited, Mr. Johnson Chukwu. Thank you very much for joining us. Now, the IMF is projecting that the Nigerian government will spend about 92% of its revenue in servicing debts in 2022. What do you make of this forecast?
I believe that IMF projection is based on the fiscal condition of the country as we speak now. If you look at 2021, the government total expenditure was in the region of 14 trillion. And the government generated just barely 6 trillion at the end of the year. Because as of November last year, the Minister of Finance said the government had generated at the federal level 5.5 trillion. So that meant that the Nigerian government must have borrowed about 8 trillion last year. And then if you add the debt service burden on that 8 trillion to our existing debt service obligations, and you also look at this year's fiscal plan, where the government is budgeting about 17.1 trillion, but it now has submitted a supplementary budget of about 2.55 trillion for fuel subsidy, taking us about 19.6 trillion, when government is projecting to raise only about 10.1 trillion, which means government now projecting about 9.6 trillion deficit. But we know that the government cannot effectively raise 10 trillion. So if the government achieves last year's budgeted revenue of actual revenue about 6 trillion, you'll be talking of a deficit of in the region of 12.6 trillion or thereabout. What that means is that the government will now pay additional interest on that 12 trillion or thereabout, plus about the 8 trillion that we must have incurred last year. So it's not out of place to project that, given that last year the government spent about 4.5 trillion out of a total revenue of about 6 trillion. So that will show you that was already in the region of 75% of total revenue. So if you add the interest burden of the last year's full impact of last year's borrowing and the impact of this year's borrowing, it won't be out of place for us to get to a point where the government will be spending at the federal level 92% of its revenue on debt service.
Now, the government continues to insist that the country does not have a debt problem, but a revenue challenge. Do you share that line of thought?
Well, like I said, for you to talk of increasing your revenue, you must increase the revenue base. It is not to impose higher burdens on those who are paying those revenue. Otherwise, you're going to tax them to death and you stifle economic growth in your country. It's to grow the base. So if the government wants to increase the revenue or tax revenue or whatever form of revenue, it must focus on growing the base of the economy. If we have a $1 trillion economy, and even if your tax rate, effective tax rate is 20%, then you're talking about $200 billion of tax revenue. But if you have a small economy, no matter how well you try to tax or how effective your tax is, you are not going to achieve materially increase your revenue. So focus should be, how do we expand the economy? How do we create economic opportunities? How do we attract investment in the economy? How do we ensure that the critical sectors of the economy that where we have corporate energy are growing and are optimizing to the point we can compete elsewhere in the world? Then the government can talk of effectively increasing its revenue. But without that, I think it's going to be a difficult call to achieve a material revenue growth without achieving material expansion in the economic activities in the country.
Now, recently, the government announced that the second phase of its strategic revenue growth initiative target is a 15% growth in revenue to GDP. Do you think this target is achievable?
Well, the key thing that the government has already said they're not taking out the subsidy until the next 18 months. The government has accepted that it will bear the burden of the subsidy. And that's why the Minister of Finance said it's going to cost us about 3 trillion naira to subsidize petroleum products this year. And the government has sent a supplementary budget. So what that means is that the government has also looked at the economic implications of that, one of which is that additional borrowing, because the entire amount will be largely borrowed, which will increase our debt service and debt obligation. Two, we must also recognize that the opportunities that will be available to the economy when there is food deregulation will not be there. And then the government must have accepted the fact that it's either going to borrow more or going to forego some of the critical sector investment that it needs to make in preference for the payment of subsidy. I think clearly, once a decision of that nature is taken, and it had already been taken, the decision makers are fully aware of the cost and benefit of whatever decision they've taken.
Well, Mr. Johnson Chukwu, CEO of Carry Assets Management Limited, thank you so much for your contribution on the program.
My pleasure.
And it's a wrap. Thank you very much for watching. I am Folashade Ogurinde. Bye for now and see you next week.